Hey all, it's Mooch. Welcome to Minding mAhs episode 19. Today we're going to talk about battery testing. Namely, if you're a vapor, does pulse testing a battery give you more real-world results? Now, some say continuous current testing is useless because we pulse our batteries as vapors. Is this true? It seems to make sense. We use anywhere, 1 second to maybe 8 seconds, maybe even a little bit longer, and when we're vaping. But when we continuously test the battery, use a continuous discharge, it can run 30 seconds to, several hours, 5 hours if I'm doing capacity tests. So what happens? Is this really true? And what happens for pulse testing versus continuous current testing? Oh, let's take a look at some test results. Now for the graph that you can see on screen now, this is a 20-watt test. And the two left-hand columns were Molicel P26A and a Sony VTC5A pulse tested. And what I did is I used a 5-second pulse or 5-second discharge followed by a 5-second rest, and I repeated that 6 times. And then I gave a 2-minute rest, namely a burst of vaping, then it's put down for 2 minutes. Then the two graphs on the right, the two bars on the right, are continuous discharge from 4.2 volts down to 2.8 volts. Now you can see for the left-hand two bars, the pulse testing, you've got about 27 minutes for the Molicel P26A and 25 minutes for the Sony VTC5A. Namely, the Molicel did a little bit better. Well, if we go to the right-hand bars, continuous discharge, you've got about 25 minutes for the Molicel P26A, and you've got about 23.7 minutes for the Sony VTC5A. Now, the actual minutes don't matter for this. What we're trying to do is figure out which is the better performer of the two, namely a shootout between them. Which one should you pick if you're vaping? If we look at the pulse test, hey, the Molicel is a little bit better. If we look at the continuous current test, wow, the Molicel is also the best performer there. Namely, there is no real difference between them. Now, the continuous current test didn't last quite as long as all the pulses added up at the time, for all the pulses added up for the other tests, the pulse testing, but the differences between them are very, very close. There's only 1% or 2% difference. So for here, continuous current test is actually quite accurate. And let's go to the next graph. This one shows, and you can see how much shorter the bars are. This is an 80-watt test. Now, this is over the rating. This is higher than the rating of VTC5A, so I don't recommend going over the rating. This is just for testing purposes. The P26A and the VTC5A, again, the P26A was a better performer for the pulse tests, the two bars on the left. With the two bars on the right, again, the P26A is a slightly better performer, and by about the same amount. There's really no difference between them. Now let's go to a third graph, and here's I've got some different cells. And pardon the background rustling noises, I have printouts of the charts that I'm looking at while I speak to you. Here I'm back also in 80-watt testing, but I'm using a Molicel P42A and a Samsung 40T just to see if this kind of relationship between pulse test, continuous current testing is the same for different batteries. And you can see the Molicel did a little better than the Samsung 40T. And then on the left with the pulse testing, when we go to the right, times are shorter overall, but the Molicel still did better than a Samsung 40T. Now the difference between them is a little bit smaller. Yeah, maybe a couple % difference there, but we can still pick out the better performer of the two. So what we learned, continuous discharges provide pretty accurate battery comparisons. Again, it's not about the amount of time, 4.2 minutes or 4.9 minutes or anything like that. It's which one is the better performer for pulse, also the better performer for continuous, because that lets us pick the better performer. So why go with continuous discharges just at all? Why not just use pulse testing? Well, continuous discharge lets us pick the better performer, so there's no disadvantage there. Provides much shorter test times. Those pulses, right, burst of pulses, and then 2 minutes rest, that can take several hours to run. And it really interferes with banging through a lot of tests. Also, continuous current testing helps to narrow down what the actual current rating of the battery is, because I can measure the temperature. The temperature of the pulse testing is only 1 or 2 degrees above ambient. Well, that's great for the battery, and that's great for us when we're vaping, but it doesn't help me determine current ratings. So I can use continuous discharges to go for current rating. Continuous discharge also provides safety information for me because I can see what happens to the battery in terms of temperatures and how dangerous it might be at different levels if there's an accidental regulated mod circuit board malfunction that discharges it continuously, or there's an accidental press on a mechanical mod that discharges the battery continuously. Continuous discharge can give us all these advantages. A pulse discharge just gives us the same information in terms of performance that we can get from a continuous discharge. Now, you might be thinking, oh, well, what if we change I vape, I take a 1 second pull or I take an 8 second pull, something different than the 5 seconds I used. Or, I go 15 seconds and I just chain vape, 15-second rest, and I just chain vape the heck out of the battery until it's dead. Or, I take 3 pulls and then nothing for 5 hours. Well, I did all those tests and I took about a week, actually almost 2 weeks, to test those, going from 1 second, 3 seconds, 5, 8, 10 seconds, 5-second rest, 15-second rest, 2-minute rest, and then these bursts that I ended up using, a burst of pulses and then nothing for 2 minutes. There was only a 1 or 2% difference in the overall running times, but the relationships were still the same. No matter what kind of pulses I took or the rest time between, the better performer for any of those pulse profiles, pulse current profiles versus continuous, was still the same. And you might be thinking, what? Why? Well, why isn't there a bigger difference? For a battery, anything over a few milliseconds is the same thing to the battery. Basically, continuous current discharge is a really long pulse. Could be 30 seconds, could be several hours. And a pulse is really just a short, continuous current discharge. Again, as I mentioned over there, anything over a few milliseconds, it thinks it's continuous. Nothing really different happens in a battery until it's empty. So these 1 to 10 second vaping time pulses are really just shorter continuous discharges to the battery. I kind of drew out a battery here, badly, to give you an idea of why that happens. Now, and I'll try to go through this quickly because I know some people don't want to know this, but it can help illustrate what goes on. Basically, you've got a positive and negative half of the battery. You've got some goop smeared onto foil, aluminum foil, and you got different goop smeared onto copper foil. Now, in a fully charged battery, all the lithium atoms are over here, which is graphite, in the negative end. If we attach a coil, and the battery is fully charged up to 4.2 volts. If we attach a coil, the electrons come out this way and start building up on this side. So now the lithium ions, they've been stripped of their electrons, go, whoa, we want to join back up with that. And they flow across through what's called the electrolyte, the liquid that's inside, organic solvents, flammable, toxic as hell. All of this is really compressed together. I've just pulled it apart to see what's going on. Well, in a battery, it only takes a few milliseconds, a few thousandths of a second, for those ions to set up the patterns, the distribution, to start the flow. And then after that, it's all the same thing. It's just more ions just going across. Any patterns, any changes in density, all of that, which happens inside a battery, depending on how hard you're discharging it, have already set themselves up. So there's really no difference between what happens at 50 milliseconds and what happens at 50 seconds. The only difference is once you start running out of atoms, lithium atoms over here, and the no more electrons it can go over, the battery voltage really starts to die at the end. That's when things make a difference. Now, if you started having pulse lengths less than 5 milliseconds, 10 milliseconds, whatever it might be for the different battery, that can make a difference because now you're stopping the pulse before all these patterns and distributions of ions can occur. But anything after that point, like I said, half a second, 10 seconds, 500 seconds, 5 hours, as long as the battery isn't approaching empty, it's all the same thing. So, is pulse testing more real-world testing? Not for us, not for vapers. Anything over a very short amount of time, a few milliseconds, it's all the same thing to the battery, and we can actually use continuous current testing to pick the best performing battery. And that's why I'm going to continue to use it. It'll remain my standard test. It's also the standard test that battery manufacturers use. It's used to set capacity and other things. And we know we can use it now to pick a better performing battery. If you've got two batteries that are within a couple % of each other in terms of performance, well, then there might be a slight difference between pulse and continuous current testing, which one is better. But there's so many other variables between battery grades, the way you vape, namely how long your pulse, how much the rest times in between, the ambient temperature, all those, that can affect the battery just as much as the difference between that couple %. You'll have to try both and see which one works better for the way you vape. But in the meantime, we can use continued current testing to get all these benefits and still get accurate results to pick the better performing battery. That's all for today. Thank you for watching.